Hey everybody, this is chapter 2 of Looking for the Proletariat by Stephen Hastings-King. What was I going to say? Sorry. The chapter's titled Rethinking Revolutionary Theory. Introduction. When a blood vessel burst in the brain of Joseph Stalin, the conqueror of happiness and freedom of the conqueror of happiness and friend of all children. On March 5th, 1953, late Stalinism's shapelessness and stagnation were transformed into a multivariate crisis. The death of Stalin, the figure around whom Soviet Marxism had been constructed since the 1930s, rendered chaotic the symbolic order. Chaos in the significations that ordered the dominant imaginary interacted with the political fragmentation of Soviet leadership to intensify the fractionalization of the party bureaucracy and complicate relations between Moscow and Eastern Europe. This chaos was mirrored institutionally in the collective, quote, Malenkov interregnum, end quote. The opening move in Socialisme Barbarie's initial reading of the situation in the USSR was not unlike what one could have found in much of the Western press. Quote, the changes that have emerged in the USSR and its satellites since Stalin's death are important because both in themselves and for the comprehension of the bureaucratic regime. The death of the personage who had been for over 20 years for the bureaucracy, the uncontested incarnation of its power, and the feared and hated despot over his own class, imposing a formidable problem of succession, would necessarily provoke upheaval amongst the bureaucracy's personnel and threaten to explode the struggles between clans that had previously been repressed by the absolute power of one person. Meanwhile, it is not enough to determine in themselves the changes in internal and external politics. If such changes take place, it is because the objective situation in Russia and its satellites increasingly impose them. Stalin's death undoubtedly facilitated them by the disappearance of the person who had incarnated the previous leadership, by the rupture of the petrification of teams and politics that characterized the last years of his reign. It, Stalin's death, must have also once again accentuated and condensed it, the objective situation, in time to the extent that the new ruling team wants to derive from them all the advantages that may favor its consolidation of power. End quote. Socialisme Barbarie. The conflict between bureaucratic factions over Stalin's successor was an internal struggle for power conditioned by the socio-economic consequences of late Stalinist, quote, shapelessness, end quote. The ravages of World War II had been followed by a long autumn of the patriarch, which appeared to be replicated in widespread shortages, poverty, and the systematic suppression of information necessary to make the economy function rationally. Stalin had presented in his person the unity of the system. Now that unity was gone, the party was improvising in an explosive situation, one that could be at any moment exacerbated by the reemergence of class conflict, quote, properly social contradictions, end quote, in Trotskyist terminology, in the context of weakened bureaucratic control. But the meaning of this could not be understood by simply aligning each bureaucratic clique with a particular social interest or sector, as if now the problems of uneven development were coming home to roost. Rather, understanding it presupposed an account of the nature of Soviet bureaucratic capitalism, quote, the, quote, etatization, end quote, of the economy and the concentration of political power that accompanies are of a piece with a tendency to control all sectors of social life, and the bureaucratic mentality favors the institution of a rigorous discipline on individuals' conduct and thought. The extent to which state control requires violence does not depend in a mechanical fashion upon the structure of the economy, but also on historical factors, the origin of the bureaucracy, the international situation, etc. The Russian bureaucracy came into existence while fabricating its own economic base. Terror was a means of imposing class unity, the hostility of all against all, for the profit of the functioning of the whole. For the profit of the functioning of the whole, end quote. Alec Nova. Or Alec Nove. I don't remember how to pronounce the name. I think it's Nove. I'm going to go with Nove. And I believe, it just says Nove here, but I believe the first name is Alec. The unity of the Soviet system was directly linked to that of the bureaucracy which had forcibly held it together. The, quote, Malenkov interregnum, end quote, was prompted by the recognition that a rapid compromise between bureaucratic factions was necessary to stabilize the party apparatus. At stake was the stabilization of Soviet society itself. From this perspective, the most interesting dimension of the struggle over succession were its inconsistencies and hesitations. Each revealed or expressed fissures or contradictions that ran through all levels of Soviet society. In domestic affairs, they included the amnesty of political prisoners, the ending of anti-Semitic, quote, doctor's plot hysteria, the lowering of prices, and the purge of the Ukrainian Communist Party. Socialisme Barbarie noted the increased complexity of relations between Moscow and Eastern Europe. The same logic explained Soviet foreign policy, particularly its pursuit of detente and a face-saving way out of Korea. But for Socialisme Barbarie, the most salient outcomes of the death of Stalin emerged during the summer of 1953 in the form of autonomous worker actions, the East Berlin, quote, June days in particular. The group's initial interpretation situated the Berlin uprising in the context of responses to Stalin's death, and by way of these to less explosive actions in Czechoslovakia and Hungary. The group's second interpretation aligned it with the August 1953 general strike that shut down France by paralyzing communications. This chapter is a critical reconstruction of the second interpretation. By situating these actions with reference to each other, Socialisme Barbarie was able to see the emergence of a new form of working-class politics with significant revolutionary potential. The group began to elaborate a revolutionary program on this basis, a vision or a schema quite innovative and very different from what the group had carried with it beyond the confines of Trotskyism. Because the rest of this book operates within this new schema, and because it informed the writing at each point, we present the whole of it now. But as you will see, neither of these actions presented this schema, nor does it show up all at once in the pages of Socialisme Barbarie. East Berlin in particular presented the group with a, quote, germ, the basis of a subsequent elaboration that enacts, implies, or creates space for it. The program itself was elaborated through the group's dialogue with the worker avant-garde, tracking and extrapolating from its actions, so the following is an extended riff, a variation, a creation of the group. A defining characteristic of this new form of political action was the appropriation of direct democratic workers' councils. Workers' councils formed within a sequence that moved from wildcat to an unlimited general strike. For Socialisme Barbarie, this sequence was a plausible trajectory for moving from worker control over production to that of society as a whole. The demands formulated by the councils linked the actions back to conflicts that unfolded in everyday life at the point of production. Demonstrating these linkages shifted examples of, quote, proletarian democratic literature, end quote, in the manner of Paul Romano's The American Worker, to a central concern. The rest of this book explores the implications of this shift and what it entailed for the group's revolutionary project. Positioning autonomous worker actions with respect to each other opens space for a transformation of the, quote, content of socialism, and, quote, a teleological device that could both provide the worker avant-garde with a sense of direction and function as the basis for a critical assessment of worker actions, both as they had happened and in their revolutionary potential. Symmetrical with this, there was a rethinking of the idea of revolution itself. As Castoriadis put it in 1955, quote, thus beginning with a critique of the bureaucracy, we have succeeded in formulating a positive conception of the content of socialism. Briefly speaking, quote, socialism in all its aspects does not signify anything other than workers' management of society, end quote. And, quote, the working class can free itself only by achieving power for itself, end quote. The proletariat can carry out the socialist revolution only if it acts autonomously. i.e., if it finds itself with both the will and consciousness for the necessary transformation of society. Socialism can be neither the fated result of historical development, a violation of history by a party of supermen, nor still the application of a program derived from a theory that is true in itself. Rather, it is the unleashing of the free creative activity of the oppressed masses. Such an unleashing of free creative activity is made possible by historical development, and the action of a party based on this theory can facilitate it to a tremendous degree. Castoriadis. The previous chapter traced Socialisme ou Barbarie's trajectory beyond Trotskyism along several lines. The development of the group's particular usage of bureaucracy to characterize the relations of production in contemporary industrial context resulted in the basis for a politically oriented form of sociology in the reading of worker experience. The emergence of these new autonomous actions gave that sociological product a political space. The group fashioned historicizing relations to Lenin, Marx, and the broader Marxian tradition. From Lenin, they abstracted something of a schema or a template that could orient a new revolutionary practice. By working through Marx, the group undercut the primacy of economic analysis in a way that opened space for more differentiated combinations of sociological, historical, political, and economic interpretations of phenomena in the social world. The links between the various steps in this process of working through relations to tradition and particular outcomes in terms of writing published in the journal were not direct. Yet with the thaw occasioned by Stalin's death and the assessments of the new worker actions, the consequences of the earlier movements became evident. In the readings of Lenin, Castoriadis placed the development of a new revolutionary program at the center of their concerns. The critique of the vanguard party militated for some kind of interaction between the revolutionary organization and a worker avant-garde, even as the location of it was not obvious at this point. The autonomous actions of the summer of 1953 provided Socialisme ou Barbarie with a plausible worker avant-garde. The sequence of actions that moved from wildcat strikes to a general strike also enabled a conceptualization of revolution as a process that broke with the militarized understanding that had been central to the Marxian tradition since the Paris Commune. But more important for the group were these actions enabled them to move to the center of their revolutionary project. The central element was direct democratic worker councils, which were the type of self-organization undertaken by the workers involved with both actions. In the group's earlier writings, Castoriadis in particular, a socialist economy is predicated upon the control by workers over the outputs of production in addition to its organization, modes of compensation, and so forth. These were presented as general defining conditions of socialism. Councils enabled these to be tied to a specific organizational modality. They arose out of conflicts specific to contemporary industrial organization that could not be addressed by the managerial and political/trade union status quo. Socialisme ou Barbarie saw them as rejecting trade union domination of working class politics in both its command-control form and its fragmenting effects on working class rejection of bourgeois forms of hierarchy in general. The calls for class unity also enabled Socialisme ou Barbarie to read off from them the effects of a kind of practical movement along a range of political options framed by the Marxist tradition. This reading off made of the worker avant-garde a mirror image of revolutionary militants. The Marxist imaginary was a shared natural horizon movement which with respect to it was the condition of the possibility of any revolutionary action. The dialogue the group saw itself as undertaking presupposed this shared horizon. This explains why the group saw the Berlin, quote, June days as exemplary, as would be the Hungarian Revolution in 1956. New section, the quote, June days. East Berlin, 16th to the 17th of June, 1953. Socialisme ou Barbarie's analysis of the East Berlin uprising of June and the French general strike of August 1953 were spread over Socialisme ou Barbarie numbers 12, 13, and 14. The central analyses published in number 13 under the rubric Workers' Struggles in 1953 interpret the two strikes together as signaling the emergence of new revolutionary initiatives from the working class that presented new possibilities and problems for revolutionary theory. Socialisme ou Barbarie's view of the East Berlin uprising was based on the work of Benno Sternberg, who was eventually published in 1958. That was eventually published in 1958 as La Classe Ouvrière in Allemagne Orientale. Pierre de Ville's introduction to the published version never mentions the author's links to Socialisme ou Barbarie. The manuscript circulated widely in anti-Stalinist left circles for several years prior to its publication, and in these circles, Sternberg's affiliations were well known. There's a footnote here that I missed. Sternberg was a Romanian Jew, a sociologist by training who spent time in Germany immediately after the war. Sternberg made his way to France by early 1948. Sternberg was a member of the Trotskyist Parti Communiste Internationaliste for a while, like Castoriadis in the four, and, I believe, left the party along with Socialisme Barbarie. Sternberg published articles in Socialisme Barbarie under the names Hugo Bell and Benno Sorel. His internal name was Barrois, Barroie. Why I said that? Barrois. I don't know why I said E. For an interesting portrait of Sternberg, see Pierre Vidal-Niquet's account of his interactions with Socialisme Barbarie. Some article in French. Souvenir et béton rompu sur Cornelis Castoriadis et Socialisme Barbarie. That's from 1989. And footnote. And there's another footnote that says, see Merleau-Ponty 1964, which is based almost entirely on Sternberg's manuscript. And footnote. Socialisme Barbarie published two early fragments of his work as one of several case studies on Eastern Europe. Footnote. The other countries extensively analyzed in the early numbers of Socialisme Barbarie were Yugoslavia and to a lesser extent Czechoslovakia. Sternberg's account of the uprising, titled Combat ouvrier sur l'avenue Staline, was published in Le Temps Moderne. There seems little doubt that Socialisme Barbarie comrade Claude Lafleur had something to do with its publication. The article constitutes the only analysis of East Berlin to appear in Le Temps Moderne, and its analytical framework reflects the views of a minority position relative to the journal's main editorial collective. Footnote. On Lafleur's relationship to the Temps Moderne collective, see Boschetti 1988, especially pages 231-2. Benno Sternberg's political position was not assimilable by the dominant tendency in the Temps Moderne collective gathered around Sartre and de Beauvoir. Boschetti points out that Lafleur was only tolerated because of his close relation with his teacher, Merleau-Ponty. The grounds for the clash between Sartre and his, quote, ultra-Bolshevik, end quote, phase, as Merleau-Ponty called it, and Lafleur were clear for some time. See the polemical exchange between Lafleur and Sartre around Sartre's article, The Communists in Peace. There's also a piece in the Castoriadis' collective works that's on Sartre. I don't know, maybe I said that already. Or maybe that's another video I said that in. But that's important. Anyway. Quote, the article, Combats, is divided into two parts, with the revolt itself forming a sort of caesura between them. Footnote. The dynamics of the revolt proper get a much fuller treatment in Sorel, which is Sternberg's nom de plume, or pen name, based in large part on the participant accounts and documents published in Ministère fédéral pour l'unité de l'Allemagne. I don't know how to say Germany in French. It's like Allemagne. I'm not sure. Anyway. End footnote. A slightly longer and earlier account of the aftermath of the, quote, June days appeared in Socialisme Barbarie, number 13, along with an article written by Vega that recapitulated the substance of the combatants, of the quote, combats article, and added to it a brief analysis of the strike demands and a critique of Trotskyist press reports. I think Vega might have emerged from the Bourdieuist milieu that lived in France in that post-war period. I'm not sure. I think that was said in the other chapter. Anyway, Sternberg's work on East Germany concentrated primarily on the relationship between the German working class and Stalinism. In particular, Sternberg focused on worker resistance to the imposition of Soviet-style social and economic organization played out in shop floor level politics. During 1947 to 48, conflict in the sectors of heavy industry most closely linked to military production involved the Communist Party, SED, trade unions, and factory committees, Comité d'entreprise, a struggle for control over production. Later conflict centered on opposition to the, quote, anti-cosmopolitan campaign, unquote. They used insistence on the superiority of Soviet technical literature and Stakhanovite production techniques and the organization of production as wedges in a broader effort to impose party control. These conflicts between the Stalinist Party faithful and local workers for political organizational power in industry did not affect all sectors simultaneously. Different industrial sectors were integrated into the plan at different times. However, once a given sector was integrated, the pattern of conflict repeated. Footnote. Stakhanovism refers to the Soviet version of Taylorist, quote, scientific management outlined by Frederick Winslow Taylor in his 1911 book, Principles of Scientific Management. Stakhanovism emphasizes that tasks and production needed to be reduced to optimal movements in order to maximize efficiency. I'm assuming that's what it says it emphasizes. I'm not sure which of the it refers to, Taylor or Stakhanovism, or both. Anyway. It emphasized that tasks and production need to be reduced to optimal movements in order to maximize efficiency. Optimization was determined with the assistance of a science of fatigue in which workers were subjected to the measurements of the time motion men, les chronos, in French slang. Taylor's work and the broader current of views on the efficiency and organization of production, of which it is a condensed expression, were fundamental to the development of the whole of assembly line-based production, from management to the use of science and measurements as an approach to work in the organization of the line itself, the center of industrial Fordism. Taylor's principles were adopted wholesale in Soviet industry. The assumption was that in a worker state, the results could not possibly be rationalized exploitation of the workers. Stakhanov was the Soviet, quote, hero of production, quote, someone who drove production norms ever higher, and as such embodied the convergence of Taylor's principles and working people. There are extensive citations on this in subsequent chapters. End footnote. Sternberg's articles trace these conflicts in the industrial sectors most directly involved in war production, 1949 to 51, and later as the effect of the construction and building trades, 1952 to 53. Neues Deutschland, the party's official newspaper, was an important source of information. Articles usually argued that the successful implementation of Stakhanovism would speed up socialist construction. The paper published stories of the struggle between Stakhanovite progress and, quote, backward local workers, and detailed their, quote, retrograde patterns of resistance. These conflicts were central because the paper was edited and written by Leninists who saw factories as both theaters of social progress and centers of party power. Quote, every factory shall be our fortress, end quote. This did not, however, mean that their sympathies necessarily lay with the party. Footnote. On Soviet Stakhanovism and its East German variant, see Siegelbaum's 1988. Thanks to Joshua Feinstein for the point on Ulbricht and Stakhanovism. End footnote. This did not, however, mean that their sympathies necessarily lay with the party. Tensions became explicit in the period leading up to the quote, June days. It is likely that these same divisions predated them, which simplified the procedure of reading this official source quote, against the grain, quote, using techniques familiar to oppositional movements that confront the hegemonic media. The two long fragments of Sternberg's book manuscript published in Socialisme Barbarie framed the group's subsequent interpretation of East Berlin. The first reviewed changes in East Germany's relationship to the USSR. Between 1945 and 1947, the Soviets considered East Germany a source of reparations. The earliest Soviet position was that, since socialism was possible in one country and given the catastrophic damage inflicted by World War II, Germany had a particular obligation to assist in its reconstruction. The integration of East Germany into the Soviet social and economic system began in 1948. In the context of these more general changes, Sternberg tracked the shifting relations between the East German working class and the Communist Party. The outline of how they would play out was established in 1945. Before the Red Army was turned loose on the population, workers hung red flags with hammers and sickles alongside the white flags in front of buildings to welcome them. They set up factory committees that were conceived of as embryonic trade unions and restarted production in some areas under the control of these committees, mistakenly assuming that this was what was meant by Stalinist notions of workers' control. Conflicts within the party were soon set off. The expectations of German KPD members who returned from exile in Moscow were very different from those of the initial, quote, core of Orthodox Stalinists, end quote, that formed, quote, outside and against the spontaneous initiative of the worker avant-garde, end quote. For Sternberg, this was the earliest of a long list of conflicts that revealed the nature of Soviet occupation. Footnote: the article provides several such indicators of Soviet occupation from 1945 to 6: poverty and material shortages, decreasing birth rates, increasing mortality rates. Sternberg also argues that the situation began to change after 1946 only because the continued extraction of reparations was no longer profitable. Footnote: the only review I've been able to locate. End footnote. Where am I? The Communist Party was not the type of party imagined by the returning exiles. The type of, quote, worker control understood by the party had nothing in common with the types of political organization anticipated by those who set up factory committees in 1945. The second article developed the last point through a series of emblematic conflicts in heavy industry. Between 1946 and 1948, each conflict brought into opposition Stalinist party cells, trade unions, and factory committees. These conflicts unfolded during the early Cold War period, which was also that of the integration of East German heavy industry into the system of Soviet military production. Sternberg's article provided a number of specific examples of conflict and derived a pattern from them. Once a party cell was established in a factory, it immediately began working to subordinate the trade union to its political direction by co-opting or replacing union functionaries. Sternberg argues that this pattern mirrored the wider experience of the German intelligentsia and its relationship to the party. Footnote: the only review I've been able to locate of La Classe Ouvrière in Allemagne Orientale criticizes Sarel, it's Sarel, I don't know if I said that already, Sarel, for emphasizing the centrality of conflicts in the factory when discussing the various alliances between the, quote, old intelligentsia and the state after 1951, arguing that this confrontation with the regime largely occurred outside the factory and was not of working class origin. See Dunka, 1951. Once in control of the Union local, the party and union began to coordinate efforts to circumvent, render ineffective, and finally eliminate the factory committees that had been established during 1946 to signal German commitment to industrial democracy. The pattern was repeated at each organizational level. At each level, mechanisms established by the workers to manage production were transformed into means of contestation within which party activists and workers struggled for control of the enterprise. These conflicts would continue until the party co-opted, contained it, or eliminated the forum. The party thought that the introduction of Stakhanovite activists and work brigades, accompanied by substantial organizational and technical modifications, and the methods for calculating production norms linked to output quotas set by the plan, would initiate the same pattern as at another level: a period of conflict, a period of co-optation, a period of consolidation, the elimination of local resistance. However, the close relationship between the brigades and ongoing production processes, the basic ambiguity of their composition and direction, meant that informal worker resistance could not be entirely eliminated. Outlining a view that fits awkward with Sternberg's interpretation in his book on the Soviet Stakhanovite movement of the 1930s, Lawrence Siegelbaum argues that the limited accommodation of contestation was integral to brigade operations. Siegelbaum, it's probably, I don't know if it's spelled different here. Yeah, I think it's Siegelbaum. Siegelbaum's view, which owes much to Michael Burrowa, I can't remember how to pronounce his name. Anyway, assumes that contestation is a permanent feature of industrial organization. Contestation functions as a feedback system that links management and production, and as an important mechanism in the continual negotiation of political relations that enables industrial production to function. This view of Stakhanovism integrates it into a more general notion of industrial organization as a continual productive conflict/debate. In contrast, Sternberg's position recapitulates that of other Socialisme Barbarie texts in positing a dichotomy between routinization and creativity and mapping it onto shop floor level conflicts. For Sternberg, on the other hand, the brigades were forms of organizational colonialism continually resisted by workers. Given the framework that he develops, Sternberg's argument would seem sufficiently compelling that, even if one were to concede that the separation is simplistic in other industrial contexts, it would be operative in this situation. We will return to this general question in subsequent chapters in the context of more granular information. Footnote. This line, consistent with the original Socialisme Barbarie editorial, is stated with most analytical clarity and not without some problems in Castoriadis 1988A. 8A, which is originally a publication of 1949, which I'm assuming is on this channel because it's from the collected works. The 1988, I think, refers to Castoriadis' writings in Socialisme Barbarie. Anyway, and footnote. The fragments of Sternberg's longer work published in Socialisme Barbarie do not address developments after mid-1948. I cannot tell if draft versions of La Classe Ouvrière covering the period between 1948 and 1953 were circulated in the group. Footnote. In the meeting transcripts that I have from the various archive sources, Sternberg's book is not mentioned as having been read by everyone as a group project in the way other texts occasionally were, but its contents were well known. End footnote. The 1958 book continues the examination of the confrontations between the Soviet-dominated Stalinist apparatus and local attempts at self-organization. In general, the Russians saw the factory as a single organic community within the worker state, which by definition had no need of oppositional organizations like trade unions. Following the same logic, there was no official recognition of discrete working class interests that were not synonymous with those of the quote worker state. Sternberg pursued his investigation of the conflicts between the party and the workers by looking at the first 5-year plan and its reorganization of production through the use of production quotas and cadences that were set at the state level without regard for the particularities of individual enterprises. Sorry, let me repeat that sentence. Sternberg pursued his investigation of the conflicts between the party and the workers by looking at the first 5-year plan and its reorganization of production through the use of production quotas and cadences that were set at the state level without regard for the particularities of individual enterprises. Conflicts triggered by new state demands were played out as struggles between the party and the trade unions and as intensified worker resistance to Stakhanovism. Footnote. Siegelbaum, 1988, provides a long, detailed account of local norm committees engaged in complex interactive processes of give and take with the production particularities in 1930s USSR. End footnote. Footnote. On the development of the Heneke movement, which Siegelbaum cites as, quote, probably the most developed of such post-war phenomena, end quote, and in East German analog to Stakhanovism, see Serrell, as in Sternberg, 1958. See also Serrell Sternberg's article Classe ouvrière et gestion des usines, in Serrell, 1958, on the types of worker resistance to the brigades, which turned them into sites of political contestation between them and the Stalinist bureaucracy and the workers, on worker resistance to the integration of the older intelligentsia into the Stalinist apparatus, on the conflict over the first 5-year plan, see pages 124 to 28. End footnote. The resistance to Stakhanovism took the form of sabotage, slowdowns, and local work stoppages. By demonstrating the persistence and intensity of this resistance, Sternberg set up his reading of East Berlin as an expression not simply of local tensions, but of much more pervasive problems that centered on the imposition of Stalinism in its concrete material forms. For Sternberg, the Berlin uprising could only be understood against this background. The revolt was rooted in the same pattern of conflict. It emerged in a particularly politicized form in Berlin for a number of reasons. After 1952, relations were tense between the highly skilled and autonomous German building trades and Soviet-style production and planning. The longer-term tension was intensified by larger structural problems like the German economic crisis, as well as by accidental factors such as the bungled introduction of the new course by the quote new course by the SED, the effects of Stalin's death, and internal detente. Footnote. A concise overview of these conjunctural factors can be found in Wolfgang H. Krauss's article, Crisis and Revolt in a Satellite, the East German Case in Retrospect, published in 1966. End footnote. Sternberg's analysis argues that the patterns of worker resistance in the context of the specific situation of the building workers were the most important of these factors in explaining the, quote, June days. The Stalin-Ala was the East German regime's monument to itself, an enormous, highly visible construction project that gathered together thousands of workers from all parts of the country. That these workers devoted to constructing a huge monument to Stalin and politicized through endless meetings organized by party activists and brigades were at the forefront of the June uprising is an irony worthy of Ambrose Bierce. Sternberg's Le Temps Moderne article exploits this irony, treating the building workers and their wildcat strike as both a metaphor for the whole East German situation and an outline of the shape of revolutionary politics to come. Quote, 1952 was the year of Stalin Avenue. Quote, 1952 was the year of Stalin Avenue, Stalin-Ala, formerly Frankfurt-Ala. Before the war, it was an opulent avenue of which nothing remains in 1945. Reconstruction began in 1949, but the real Stalin-Ala was born at the beginning of 1952. Work sites end to end along 4 kilometers. In all adjacent streets, teams of factory workers, in principle voluntary, cleared the ruins. In winter, one worked by electric torchlight. The Stalin-Ala was the pride of the regime, which had made it the center of East Berlin life and, in a sense, of East German life. Press and radio, writers and composers adopted it as a favorite theme. The teams of party agitators formed discussion groups there that swelled with passers-by, construction site workers, those who cleared sites. Tens of thousands of building workers flowed into it. They were needed. They were the center of interest. Meanwhile, the construction industry ran at a loss, and the administration again posed the question of production norms. End quote. Sorel, or Sternberg. Where am I? The integration of the construction trades into the planned economy began in early 1952, roughly coinciding with the change in scale of the Stalin-Ala. It set off intense conflict. Once again, integration into the planned economy began with the setting of production quotas that could not be met. These quotas created deficits that could only be made up through the introduction of, quote, superior Soviet techniques. Quote, shock brigades introduced these new techniques that included the reorganization of tasks and production speed-ups. Wages were redefined to tie in more directly to production levels. Building workers collectively refused to accept the changes and soon found themselves in conflict with the state. The workers used a variety of grounds to justify their refusal to comply. These ranged from protest over what amounted to wage reductions to public statements that equated rationalization and de-skilling. For Benno Sternberg, this widespread informal resistance to the Stalinist reorganization of work was best expressed in the transformation of brigade meetings into theaters of conflict. Workers often emerged from these meetings with more clearly articulated arguments for resisting organization. Brigade meetings were frequently covered by correspondents from Neues Deutschland. Their articles, designed to show the retrograde character of local workers, paradoxically made public and circulated workers' arguments. In the weeks immediately prior to the 16th to the 17th of June, articles in Neues Deutschland on these meetings outlined workers' criticisms of the state's effort to tie wages directly to the new and largely unreachable norms in a context of rising prices and material scarcity. These accounts highlighted the awkward position in which brigade leaders were placed by such objections. Brigade leaders were workers themselves and were also affected by the problems of tools and material. They might be personally or politically inclined to sympathize with the workers. At the same time, their positions as activists gave them significant material privileges. There were, therefore, limits to how far the brigade leaders' sympathies with the workers opposed to integration could go. For Sternberg's purposes, the accounts of these brigade meetings provided in the party press were a staging of the larger conflicts he wanted to trace. The official response to this resistance was usually to publicly condemn it and then convene a meeting. One such meeting, a joint productivity conference, gathered together administration workers, union officials, and, quote, activist workers, convened on the 22nd of February 1953, during which it was decided to cut wages, materials, and tools, and at the same time to raise production levels. A second conference was held in April to determine how to implement the decisions of the first. Yet another was held in June. At the same time, a complicated dance involving the apparatus and workers was occurring on the construction sites, closely monitored by the official press. Production levels were raised, temporarily lowered, then, quote, voluntarily, and, quote, raised again. The editorial chorus in Neues Deutschland glossed this stop and start as revealing the machinations of, quote, backward elements, and, quote, bent on hindering socialist progress, retrograde carryovers from the bad old days of class struggle. Because of its timing, this conflict over the integration of construction into the planned economy is explosive. The political fallout of Stalin's death, internal conflicts in the SED, the easing of war tensions, and open ambivalence in Moscow as to East Germany's status all exacerbated tensions created by persistent material and food shortages, rising prices, and falling wages. On the 9th of June, the Politburo issued its quote, new course, an official self-criticism in which the party acknowledged errors and offered some concessions as recompense. However, these concessions were directed primarily at the middle class and the church. Construction workers had just been hit with what amounted to a salary cut. The quote, new course did not address this or any other worker grievance. This quote, oversight was a trigger for the action. The unrest surfaced at the Stalin-Ala for several reasons, having to do with its particular status and the conditions that prevailed there. The project's size made it exceptionally visible, and its political significance made it a particular focus of the party press and political education/agitation. Neues Deutschland devoted extensive coverage to the project and its problems. Because it was a memorial to Stalin, the party orchestrated an extensive campaign of political education. Marxist discussion circles convened regularly at various locations around the site. This agitation had two key unintended consequences. First, workers were forced to attend the political classes, which provided them with an opportunity to actually read Marx and Lenin undiluted by the official party catechism. This was a crucial dimension for Sternberg's reading of the actions. He argued that this direct exposure to Marx and Lenin gave the construction workers access to Marxist categories and a history of class struggle that they would later appropriate to express themselves and to articulate their demands. These same meetings also enabled workers to establish contacts and create networks that extended beyond the normal boundaries of production. Particular construction sites, work brigades, and shifts, both were necessary preconditions for the quote, June action. The power of these normal boundaries and an indication of how unusual was the case of the Stalin-Ala can be seen by comparing it to Daniel Mota's article La Grève chez Renan, which appeared in Socialisme and Barbarie in number 13. In this article, Mote describes a small group of machinists who tried to organize some kind of action in support of the August 1953 Post, Telephone, and Telegraph strike, the PTT strike. As the strike was violently opposed by the entire range of trade unions, this mobilization would have had to happen outside their control. Mote and his comrades quickly run into the fragmented communicative conditions of modern industrial organization. This fragmentation was on its own too great a barrier to overcome, and the mobilization efforts came to nothing. The ability of workers to communicate across the complex divisions of large-scale production is a special situation. It is an important result of militant activity. The week of the 8th to the 14th of June was marked by considerable unrest along the Stalin-Ala. During this same week, political division began to emerge within the Neues Deutschland coverage. By the end of the week, the paper was publishing accounts of brigade meetings that explicitly sided with the workers against the party and official union leaders. On the 14th of June, the paper published a collection of worker accounts of conditions. The following rather lengthy excerpt is revealing, quote, on the 28th of May, when following the official news that 60% of the workers had raised their norms, a meeting of the Stalin-Ala brigade leaders and activists took place. This assembly of men, considered by the regime as its best supporters, rejected the majority of the norms on which the government had just decided. The Stalin-Ala party secretary, Müller, had been against the meeting. It had occurred on the initiative of brigade leader Roca. Quote, he's the one who got us into this, end quote, said Müller. Brigade leader Roca, it seems, had organized the meeting on his own without the support of any apparatus. He had, in fact, serious reasons to have something against the party and management. At the beginning of May, his brigade began working on a new construction site. Quote, I had only just got there when 3 men from the party's central leadership, including the time motion man, came to discuss production norms. I asked them to wait until I had assembled my entire brigade, because half of them worked on another street. But the time motion man told me that my colleagues had just given their approval to raising production levels and that the site foreman had their signatures in his pocket. I replied that this was a lie, and I was right. The maneuver had failed. The quote chrono declared to me that, at any rate, he only allowed brigades that had agreed to higher production levels to work on the bigger sites. Quote, over there we raised our levels by 6.5%. End quote, end quote. And that's from an article by Sternberg. The immediate result of Brigadier Roca's story was that the workers discovered that there had been lots of problems with the norm department. Some of these had even triggered work stoppages. As words of these stoppages became public, the chief of the Berlin Communist Party argued that discipline needed to be stepped up and an example made. The Neues Deutschland editorial that accompanied the 14th of June 1953 collection of accounts that detailed conditions along the Stalin-Ala opposed this, arguing, quote, the quote Kronos have lost all contact with the colleagues in the work sites. They carry themselves with arrogance. The quote Kronos tell themselves that, thanks to their dangerous schemes, they will be highly rated by management. But they are wrong because an enterprise will never function without the workers. The quote Kronos should not imagine that they will succeed for long if they act against the interests of the workers. End quote. And that's from Sorel, 1953. And remember that Chronos means like time. People. Like time. Kind of like Chronos referring to like, I don't know, time managing people. This is the kind of moment upon which Sternberg relied. The editorial attacked the party by attacking the quote Kronos, who walked point on the question of norms. It also revealed the kinds of coercion that they routinely brought to bear on brigade leaders. For example, only brigades that exceeded production levels could get access to the larger and better paying sites. Often this pressure forced brigade leaders to act against the interests and desires of the workers. In this case, the brigade leaders sided with the workers against the party primarily because of the clearly duplicitous way in which the party, represented by the quote Kronos, treated the workers. For Socialisme Barbarie's reading of the situation, what mattered here for analytical purposes was that the workers recognized that their interests diverged from those of the party, and the fact that the workers' assembly played a prominent role in this recognition. Only once assembled publicly did information surface about similar problems with the quote Kronos at other sites, such as about limited work stoppages and the threats issued by the party. In this context, shaped by Soviet notions about how workers should comport themselves in a workers' state, the act of coming together unofficially to share information was already political. On the afternoon of the 8th of June, after 8 days of inconclusive negotiations, workers from Sector 40 of the Stalin-Ala voted to strike and march on the Ministry building. They stopped work on the 16th of June and about 100 workers began to march. By the time they reached the Ministry building, the march had grown to almost 10,000 people. During the night of the 16th to the 17th of June, the strike spread quickly and changed from a limited protest over the imposition of higher production norms and piecework rates into a general political strike. For Sternberg, this night was a moment of extreme clarity. Popular action shot the gaps created by the incoherence of East German social relations. Faced with a rapidly developing revolutionary situation, the state teetered. That night, power passed from the state onto the streets. Quote, on the 16th and 17th of June, the workers, the popular masses, went out into the street and held the power of decision and execution. The break between officialdom and the population was total. For that day at least, the ambiguity characteristic of relations within East German society was erased. That is why it is not possible to trace the image of the quote June days using only official sources. To the extent that the masses in June 1953 made themselves independent, gave themselves their own organizations, no longer expressing themselves by the means, multiple to be sure, but diversionary, ordered by official organizations. To that extent, it is only possible to approach the truth by relating directly to the actions of masses. What matters from then on is that one attend to the testimonies of those who participated in the revolt. Sorel or Sternberg. Understanding the nature of the movement and explaining the speed with which it evolved were problematic for ex post facto analysts, not only because both were impossible to reconstruct from official sources. Footnote. This would not have surprised Socialisme Barbarie militants, who would interpret it as analogous to the inability of bureaucratic management in industrial settings to recognize the informal self-organization of workers, even though the daily operations of the system as a whole relies upon the continued existence and efficient operation of these very collectives. This translates into what Castoriadis called the, quote, central contradiction of bureaucratic capitalism, end quote. End footnote. Such actions by their nature exceed representation. They are forms of collective doing. The representation is like an audio recording of an improvisation that captures everything but the improvised part. The revolt itself was and remained a hole in the middle of Sternberg's analysis. One might argue that the essential had already been explicated through his analysis of the long-term resistance to the, quote, bureaucratic colonialism, end quote, practiced by Stalinist organization. Initially, Stalinism was welcomed by the German workers because they saw it as a different type of communism. But these same workers later resisted Stalinism through continual struggle at the point of production. The Stalin-Ala workers were therefore typical East German workers. However, without the benefit of the particular conditions that prevailed in the Stalin-Ala, it is doubtful that these workers could have moved from isolated struggles to collective action. What made this action paradigmatic for Socialisme Barbarie was its ideological dimension, the turning of Marx against the dominant Marxism evident in the modes of organization by strike committee and in the demands for substantive worker control over production. By the morning of 1917 of June, German police and military forces and Soviet armor began moves to suppress the revolt. It had spread overnight to encompass about 400 and 500 locations. The strikes continued for some time after the violent clashes in Berlin on the 17th of June, but they are largely invisible to those outside. While Sternberg's work lay at the center of Socialisme Barbarie's collective understanding of the Berlin uprising, the group advanced two other closely linked readings. The first was published in Socialisme Barbarie No. 12, apparently written sometime in June 1953. This reading positioned the, quote, June days in the context of Stalin's death and the succession crisis that followed. The action demonstrated the group's premise that the problems experienced by the party were necessarily crises, both for the party itself and for the social system that it held together. The, quote, June days were a direct expression of a general crisis created by disunity in the party, which was itself the unity of the social system. Socialisme Barbarie's second interpretation was framed as a critical analysis of the coverage of the uprising in the Trotskyist press. This reading tried to unpack the political implications of the demands promulgated by the workers during the night of the 16th to the 17th of June. This analysis was written later in the summer in light of the French PTT strike. It works out of comparative framework that positions the Berlin action against the PTT strike to argue that they together signaled a new type of revolutionary politics. To understand this claim and its implications for Socialisme Barbarie's revolutionary theory more generally, we turn to their understanding of the French general strike. New section: the August 1935 French General Strike. During the evening of the 5th of August 1953, a committee of Force Ouvrière militants at the Bordeaux PTT office launched a strike to protest against the Laniel government's attempt to cut public sector workers' salaries and retirement benefits. Spreading along the PTT communication and transport networks, within days, it had become an unlimited general strike involving more than 4 million workers. The strike shut down the post, telephones, and nearly all public transport. It paralyzed the country and cut it off from the outside world. From the outset, French trade unions CGT, FO, CFTC scrambled to contain the action and reassert themselves as necessary mediators between the working class and the state. Despite intense pressure from the government and unions and internal problems that will be discussed later, the strike held until the 21st of August. At that time, with the movement already weakening, the unions and the Laniel government cut a deal that simply accelerated the strike's dissipation. It is surprising that an action of this magnitude had for a long time vanished from the history of the Fourth Republic. One exception was Georgette Elgy's book Les Républiques des Contradictions, 1951 to 1954. Her description of a panicking Laniel government and military is tempered by a certain admiration for the strikers. The strike received a more detailed analysis in Jean-François Noël's 1977 monograph, from which most subsequent accounts draw their information. There are several plausible explanations for its disappearance from histories of the Fourth Republic. The 1953 PTT strike was, for the most part, a peaceful action that generated relatively benign demands. Its character is evident when compared with the near civil war that accompanied the 1955 shipbuilders' strike at Nantes and Saint-Nazaire. The PTT strike occurred in isolation. It took place during the annual summer holiday and generated much sympathy in that it caused little inconvenience. It was also isolated in the sense that it was neither followed by other actions nor evoked by later actions. Not the finest moment in the history of the French trade unions, the August strike was never incorporated into their institutional memories. It came too soon to be appropriated by the reconfigured anti-Stalinist French, quote, New Left that emerged. Sorry, I'm in a big car. Let's go. Ugh. Where am I? That emerged during 1957 as a function of the combined impact of the Algerian War and the crisis of Stalinism. While Socialisme Barbarie's theoretical positions would deeply influence this, quote, New Left, it is a measure both of the group's isolation in 1953 and of the selective power of the context within which Socialisme Barbarie was later appropriated that its treatment of the strike was also forgotten. Most of the group's interpretations of the 1953 strike was elaborated in a series of articles in Socialisme Barbarie. Most of the group's interpretations of the August 1953 strike was elaborated in a series of articles in Socialisme Barbarie number 13. A short introduction and chronology was followed by Daniel Faber's article on the PTT strike. Georges Petro detailed how the strike spread along the French railway system. Daniel Motet, about whom I have more to say in subsequent chapters, described the response of the Renault workers to the strike in the days after the end of the summer holidays. A short account of strikes amongst the, quote, Bourgeois gare, linchpins of the PTT system of mail distribution was written too late for number 13 and appeared in the next issue. Taken altogether, these articles developed the following general points. The August 1953 action was a spontaneous general strike that occurred outside the control of and against conventional bureaucratic political and trade union organizations. It rejected both the existing organizations and the type of politics they practiced. Using the example of the collusion between the state and the trade unions to end the strike, Socialisme Barbarie demonstrated that all bureaucratic organizations participated in one way or another in the same socioeconomic game and defended the same general interests. Socialisme Barbarie's history of the strike tried to portray it as a manifestation of a working class unity that formed in the period leading up to the action. Trade union resistance necessarily put them in opposition to worker interests. The PTT strike also provided important lessons on the problems of worker self-organization. Socialisme Barbarie saw the strike as hampered by the workers' reliance on status quo ideology. However, the strike's demands, particularly for direct worker control over production, signaled the emergence of a new political terrain. This politics was directly comparable with that which, briefly, emerged during the East Berlin, quote, June days. This section considers the nature of the PTT and the context that shaped the August strike. In 1953, the PTT was the most important public sector operation in France. It was responsible for mail, telegraph, and telephone services. The PTT was also involved with banking, which was and is associated with the others because of the link between the telegraph and wire transfers. It is best understood as a system of interlocked, specialized distribution networks. Of these, the postal system was the most important, complex, and difficult. The post was a bureaucracy set up to move high volumes of specialized material from place to place. The mail moved through a network of distribution centers that were linked together by railroad. The postal and rail systems were therefore tightly imbricated. The close relationship is reflected in the way the 1953 strike spread. By the early 1930s, this system was under pressure. The volume of mail passing through it was steadily increasing. State budgetary constraints ruled out a redesign of the system or even an upgrade of existing technology to accommodate the increased volume. The increased volume, therefore, meant speeding up the pace of circulation and work throughout the existing system. The system, in its barest outline, relied heavily on manual labor. Mail was hand-sorted, dragged about in large, heavy bags, and manually loaded onto trains. These bags were manually offloaded, resorted, and delivered. Delivery was usually done by bicycle or on foot, regardless of the weather. Trucks were still not widely used in 1953. The system was essentially the same as it had been 50 years earlier. Several Socialisme Barbarie members told me about an article Philippe Guillaume, I don't have internet access where I'm at right now. I forget how to pronounce his name. But Guillaume wrote after quitting the OECD in 1958. The article described working as a mail handler at the Saint-Lazare station in Paris, loading and offloading 50 to 100-pound bags of mail to and from trains 8 hours per night, the work exacting an enormous physical toll, invisible to the passengers boarding or leaving the same trains. Footnote: the article was interpreted in a variety of ways as a reflection of the conditions under which these workers labored beneath the noses of the bourgeois passengers, yet invisible to them, as an index of Guillaume's suffering for his decision after the de Gaulle coup of May 1958 to, quote, go amongst the workers, and, quote, as an index of his drinking problem. Unfortunately, I have yet to locate a copy of this article. End footnote. In 1953, if one wanted to communicate across distance in France, one used the mail. The telephone system was rather primitive. Most calls required an operator to make the appropriate connections. Nonetheless, the volume of telephone calls was also steadily increasing. This placed yet another strain on an already overburdened system. In every PTT sector, the same story obtained. Increased traffic pushed the system to its limit and outstripped the capacities of available, largely manual technology. This pressure resulted in steadily increasing production speeds and steadily deteriorating work conditions. As one example among many, the physical effects of deteriorating work conditions included increased rates of repetitive motion problems amongst telephone operators. Meanwhile, the same budgetary restrictions that prevented technological upgrades also caused slowdown in hiring and promotion. Already low wages stagnated. The PTT's internal problems were linked to and exacerbated by the more general stagnation of the French economy, caused in large measure by the Vietnam War. Footnote: the cost of war and its effects on French workers was a constant theme in L'Humanité's polemics against the governments from 1947 on. Quote, Vietnam is being fought on the backs of the working class, and, quote, is a typical slogan. End footnote. Economic stagnation preoccupied the governments of the early 1950s, which were dominated by the right. In 1952, Pinay tried to address the problem by imposing wage and price freezes. In practice, employers observed the wage freeze and ignored the price controls. Not surprisingly, this resulted in a marked decline in the working class standard of living. After Pinay's resignation and a prolonged ministerial crisis, the conservative and business-friendly J. Laniel formed a government hobbled by fractured, contentious relations between parties of the right. Footnote: Pinay resigned on the 23rd of December 1952. Ren Mayer's government on the 7th of January to the 21st of May 1953, and particularly the period immediately following his resignation, is referred to here as the prolonged ministerial crisis. The Gaullist Joseph Laniel was appointed on the 26th of June and wasted little time before going after the public sector workers. For a general overview, see View 1987. For a detailed account of the French foreign and domestic crises, political paralysis, and economic difficulties of the politically fragmented period from 1951 to 53, with a large focus on ministerial intrigues, see LG 1968. And footnote. Although Laniel considered Pinay and his policies to be old-fashioned, he picked up where Pinay left off, making a renewed effort to use austerity to revive the economy. Unlike Pinay, Laniel actively opposed the program of social benefits that the Communist Party of France had secured for public sector workers during its tenure as part of the 1947 tripartite government. So, Laniel added an attack on social benefits to Pinay's budgetary austerity program. This guaranteed that his program would encounter opposition. To head off this opposition, Laniel requested, quote, special powers from the National Assembly in July 1953. He then waited until most French workers, with the exception of those in the public sector, were on summer holiday before announcing his program. It would have cut public sector social benefits and would have exacerbated already deteriorating conditions in the PTT by suspending any new recruitment, increasing the retirement age, cutting pensions, and freezing wages. Footnote: the surreal reliance on the idea that austerity is a way to address socioeconomic problems has continued across the entire period that separates the writing of the dissertation on which this book is based to the revamping of this chapter for publication. At this point in 2012, the cognitive paralysis involved is as much about the slow collapse of the American empire as anything else. End footnote. The program triggered an explosion of long-running conflicts within the PTT over attrition and wages. Footnote: see Noel 1977 for an account of the program of attrition, the elimination of highly paid, relatively skilled positions through test results, sackings, and non-replacement of retirees. End footnote. Footnote: see Faber 1954 for a table of PTT national minimum salaries according to job description and location. While the article does not provide detailed information on the cost of living, it is universally agreed that the wages paid to PTT workers, particularly the less skilled workers involved in distribution operations, was extremely low. End footnote. In J.F. Knoll's 1977 analysis, these economic factors explain the unified nature of the worker action. Noel relied heavily on the strike coverage that appeared in the PCF-owned newspaper L'Humanité. To counter L'Humanité's partisan distortions, Noel read a cross-section of the trade union press. The coverage devoted to the strike in L'Humanité, like its coverage of all working class issues, aimed to reinforce the, quote, unity of the PCF-CGT and the working class, usually by referring to the legacy of the 1936 Popular Front. Following his sources faithfully in his assumption that wage issues are naturally political and that the organizations express this, Noel explained the strike in terms of long-term, largely economic tensions. That said, Noel is careful to assign the strike's origin on organizational affiliation. It was initiated in Bordeaux by revolutionary syndicalist militants who were affiliated with the FO for anti-communist reasons. Socialisme Barbarie's account incorporated different assumptions about the nature of the work of working class politics. Instead of treating solidarity as a quasi-natural outcome of wage disputes, the articles analyzed how workers actively constructed a sense of class solidarity. The group argued that while long-term economic and organizational tensions within the PTT played important roles in the strike and its timing, they provided only an abstract explanation of the action. D. Faber argued that in order to explain the unity of the workers in the face of Laniel's actions, one had to look to the events of the winter of 1952. PTT workers had agitated independently for a united trade union front to advance their demands for a pay differential to compensate them for handling Christmas season volume increases. This same movement for trade union unity was still active in early 1953. Workers organized a large meeting at the Salle Wagram by direct subscription, renewing calls for trade union unity. At this meeting, representatives of the FO, CFTC, and CGT found themselves on the same stage, despite the CGT having categorically refused to meet with the others. Footnote. Direct subscription meant that the workers create their own subscription rolls, raised money, and coordinated publicity directly, thereby bypassing the unions. And footnote. Footnote. The balance of power amongst the trade unions in the PTT was somewhat atypical. The FO was numerically dominant across the board. The CGT controlled certain sectors by virtue of controlling certain trades, particularly metallurgy in the broadest sense. Amongst the predominantly female telephone operators, the Christian OFTC, which elsewhere was usually in the minority, was dominant. End footnote. Footnote, the CGT in particular was not anxious to meet with representatives of FO, not surprising given that the Force Ouvrière, financed by the U.S., split with the PCF-dominated CGT in 1947. End footnote. Union representatives also found themselves before a room full of PTT workers whose attendance amounted to a demand that the unions put aside the logic of pluralism and act together to advance common working class interests. For Faber, this movement was an important precondition for the August 1953 strike. It provided workers with a concrete experience of self-organization around issues that opposed them to the unions, the PTT, and the state. From this experience, Faber argued, PTT workers began to develop a sense of class solidarity and the outline of an autonomous organization. Socialisme Barbarie's understanding of the strike tactics also diverged from those of the strike's other interpreters. For LG and Noel, the PTT movement was a curious anachronism, a sudden and strange reemergence of revolutionary syndicalist traditions, comprehensible as an imprint given to the strike by the Bordeaux FO militants whose agitation sparked it. Footnote, see Kriegel 1964 on the effects of the disastrous 1920 railroad strike on the revolutionary syndicalist wing of the SFIO. I think also by that period, it's kind of a strange thing. I'm not really actually sure, so I'm talking at my ass a little bit. I know that syndicalists were like a big part of, like, I'm pretty sure, like, Pierre Monod, I think, was like one of the big people, and also, what's his name? Alfred Rosenberg, not sure. Alfred Rosmer, that's the I'm thinking of. And maybe Boris Souverain as well, were like active like syndicalists, and they were like pretty important in forming the French Communist Party. But I think a lot of them kind of like dipped out of that pretty early. Like I think even before like the formation of the left opposition, even though a lot of them were kind of like somewhat Trotsky supporters. I'm not exactly sure. I might be talking at my bum. Anyway, in contrast, Socialisme Barbarie argued that the action would be seen as an active reappropriation of the general strike as a weapon, for reasons shaped by context and conditions of 1953 that incidentally involved older traditions as such. The strike was an important example of worker self-organization and an assertion of a new political space. For the group, the strike itself presented mixed results. It arrayed the ensemble of the French working class against Laniel's program and prevented its implementation. Massive public support hemmed in Laniel and prevented the government from declaring the strike illegal and requisitioning transportation. Popular support for the strike also made it politically impossible to use the police to intimidate the strikers. Further, the government's nervousness over the inability to end or even contain the strike began to escalate into panic as the end of summer holidays approached, bringing with it the prospect of an even bigger, even more politically damaging strike. The trade unions were in a similar situation. Their inability to control the strikers undermined their claims to represent the working class. All sought ways to de-escalate and get in front of the strike, preferably on terms tactically advantageous to themselves. They shared the government's panic about the end of the summer holiday, recognizing that a spreading strike would imperil the government. The FO and CFTC decided that their primary loyalty had to rest with the state. This decision prompted them to conclude agreements with Laniel that undercut the strike. For Socialisme Barbarie, this was a, quote, trade union betrayal. Because of what they saw as limitations in thinking about organization, the workers were in no position to respond to union actions by the 21st of August. These facts framed the group's interpretation of the strike. From a revolutionary perspective, the workers gained important experience through the strike. Particularly important were its development outside of union control and its achievement of some concrete, if narrowly defined, political goals. However, the strikers' inability to respond to the quote, trade union betrayal demonstrated that the workers were still conditioned by the dominant ideology and by the major political and trade union organizations. Quote, it was at this moment that the entire working class did not know how to transcend the narrow limits within which trade unions had enclosed the strike. The public sector workers did not openly advance more general demands, and the other workers, the metal workers in particular, did not recognize in these strikes the struggles of all workers against their oppressors. Meanwhile, despite the great confusion that reigned in the minds of the strikers as to the ultimate objectives and real possibilities of the movement, no illusions remained about the so-called economically and politically neutral character of the strike. The strikers understood the political stakes in a struggle that put them against the government, and the oldest workers talked to the young about June 1936. End quote. And it says Dussard is that quote's from, and that, but I'm not sure who that is. It's probably a pen name of somebody. Anyway, end quote. Socialisme Barbarie saw the August 1953 strike, therefore, as presenting the revolutionary movement, comprised of the worker avant-garde, the strikers, and the theoretical work carried on by revolutionary militants that developed in parallel with that avant-garde, with new potential and new problems. Even though the strike had shut France down for 2 weeks, it proved quite fragile in the end. There were problems of organization and coordination. By the time the strike collapsed, some workers had begun to address these problems in a limited way by forming interprofessional liaison committees. Socialisme Barbarie argued that these committees might have formed the core of a new, more comprehensive organization. Workers also organized subscription campaigns to raise money for their families, who suffered along with them because the unauthorized action had cut them off from union strike funds. Each of these initiatives was important. The main problem that Socialisme Barbarie saw was the strike's lack of directly elected strike committees. These committees should have been capable of coordinating strategy. Their absence enabled the unions to form their own steering committees, which played a crucial role in ending the action. Socialisme Barbarie also argued that the strike limited itself by not moving beyond the syndicalist tactic of, quote, grève ou bras croisés. I don't know what that means. This is with a silent refusal to work. Typically, the strikers stood at their workstations with their arms folded. Noel described strikers leaving home each morning to gather near the workplace to look at each other and thereby assure themselves that something was still happening. The strikers never took their protests to the streets, never organized demonstrations. Street demonstrations would have brought the strike to the public and thereby into a more explicitly political realm. In this regard, the French workers were not as radical as their Berlin counterparts. For Socialisme Barbarie, the PTT strike posed several important questions. How should an autonomous strike organize itself? How should it provide itself with a continuity? How should it deploy publicly? How might workers and theorists think about the importance of momentum? The PTT strike demonstrated that, without some mechanism to assure the continuity of demands and action, strikes become increasingly fragile over time. For Socialisme Barbarie, the lack of adequate organization explained the gap that separated the strike's initial period of spontaneity and its subsequent drift. It also explained the strikers' lack of clarity as to its goals. The organization problem prevented the strike from adapting to a shifting, complex situation. 1 second. Oh, you fuck. Fuck me. One second. No! Fuck! Sorry, you get to hear that. I just killed my car battery. For those concerned, I'm fine. Anyway, from the earliest articles, Socialisme Barbarie compared the French with the French and East Berlin strikes. I did have a stroke, meaning I can't speak correctly anymore. Where am I? In the latter, workers immediately took their action to the streets. They elected strike committees that provided forums for collective deliberation, from which issued coherent, politically substantive demands. Soviet tanks precluded any longer-term developments. The question of the longer-term adequacy of strikes committees therefore remained unanswerable. From Socialisme Barbarie's perspective, the East Berlin action was more advanced, more revolutionary. Articles pointed to the Berlin workers' sophisticated ideological foundation rooted in their intensive exposure to Marx of the party-controlled reading circles at the Stalin-Ala. If the building workers were exemplary because they appropriated Marxist categories to articulate their opposition to a state that built itself ideologically on the same basis, the sentiment behind their action was universal. Its universality in the German context was evident in the spread of the action during the evening of the 16th to the 17th of June. It was universal in the context of Socialisme Barbarie's vision of the working class, because these Marxist categories underpinned the group's entire project and ordered the comparative readings of strikes. East Germany presented a unified political context amenable to Socialisme Barbarie's understanding of revolutionary politics. The French political context was far more fragmented. Daniel Mottet's article La Grève chez Renault, which we referenced earlier, used the machine shop in which he worked at Renault's Billancourt factory as a microcosm within which was observable the nature and effects of this political fragmentation. The article details the way in which the Billancourt workers received the PTT strike during its last days as they returned from their summer holidays. On August 18th, 1953 marked the return to work for the less senior metal workers. In the Metallos, where the largest, most politicized, volatile industrial trade, the Metallos, where, or the Metallo, or I don't know what I'm saying. It looks like Metallos, I don't know how to pronounce it in French. Were the largest, most politicized and volatile industrial trade in France, the quintessential worker in the left-wing mythology. The possibility that they might join in the strike caused panic amongst the government and the trade unions. The PCF-CGT, dominant amongst metal workers, stood to lose most if these workers joined the strike. At one level, the coverage of the return to work in the PCF's daily newspaper, L'Humanité, can be read as playing to the vanity of the Metello constituency. The paper devoted much of its 18th of August reportage to the events of Billancourt. The following day, it's probably Billancourt, I don't know. The following day, a short article entitled Premier de Brayage chez Renault où la rentrée n'était que partie. I don't know. Began with a single voice assessing the situation. Quote, and us, we got started yesterday. Renault reopened. 10 to 15,000 workers returned from vacation. The phrase was on everyone's lips, the question in everyone's eyes. Okay. The implication is clear. With the return of the Renault metal workers, the real workers had entered the scene. The real workers are looking around trying to figure out the situation. And because the PCF-CGT opposed the PTT strike, the real working class was already acting by not doing anything. At the same time, Socialisme Barbarie's version of the real workers, Motet's AOC, Atelier Outillage Central, the limited-run machine shop where Motet and Herzl worked, voted to strike. Later that day, a joint CGT-CFTC-FO meeting produced a tract that announced the formation of a unified trade union front. Trade union unity had been one of the PTT workers' central demands. Here it was occurring at Billancourt, in a political context dominated by the CGT. The strike spread across the plant during the 20th of August. L'Humanité printed another joint tract. According to L'Humanité, the entire Billancourt factory was shut down on the 21st of August. The unity of the working class behind the PCF-CGT banner, the natural order of things from the party's viewpoint, was achieved and reflected in a, quote, magnificent meeting, end quote, called by the three main unions that afternoon. Motet's article can be read as a parody of La Humanité's coverage of the situation at Billancourt. The article employs transcribed worker conversations. Rather than issuing from the real working class, Motet puts the conversations in the mouths of scattered groups of younger militant workers who spend the early part of the week of 18th of August wandering around the political geography of Billancourt, trying to figure out where the strike was and why nothing was being coordinated. Motet portrays these workers and himself as initially quite enthusiastic about returning to work under conditions that bode so well for an extension of the holidays in the form of a strike. Once actually back at work, Motet and his unnamed comrades walked into the factory with growing dismay. They tried to initiate a work stoppage in solidarity with the PTT strikers. Their efforts were met with an initial enthusiasm that soon dissipated in the face of union hostility and threats of reprisal. The union representatives seemed to patronize Motet and his friends, and from Motet's viewpoint, the workers in general. They also seemed to view the small work stoppage they orchestrated as something of a joke. Quote, the CGT delegate also showed up excited like everyone else. Quote, what do you think, he asked, with conspiratorial winks. What was thought was clear. The vast majority of the shop did not want to go back to work, end quote. By the 20th of August, however, CGT representatives were openly hostile. Motet and his comrades roamed the factory on the 18th of August, trying to convene meetings between workers during which they might discuss what to do without the interference of the union delegates. Their journey took them around the whole political landscape of Billancourt. They began amongst the highly skilled, relatively autonomous shops of the l'artillerie, or machine repair, where there was some enthusiasm, as there was in the AOC, limited run machine shop, which voted to stop work. By the time Motet and his comrades arrived at Department 55, cutting bars and shock absorbers, they numbered around about 60 workers. They were able to force a stoppage of work in the department by surrounding everyone who tried to keep working. While this was going on, union representatives had withdrawn from the floor waiting to see what happened. At the center of each stoppage was a small meeting. The main demand that issued from these meetings was the convening of a large central factory meeting by the CGT the next afternoon. The CGT convened a small meeting in the AOC, an obvious ploy to limit the previous day's agitation. The AOC workers voted to continue the strike. Groups of workers set off to a different series of semi-skilled departments. First, Department 88, drivetrains, then Department 31, bodywork, Décor de Carrosserie. In Department 31, the AOC workers encountered resistance from both the foremen, who pressured the workers under their command to stay at their machines, and from the union delegates. Quote, at this moment, while in Department 31, an incident occurred that summed up the entire orientation of the trade unions in this movement. The CGT delegates from our shop came in furious and began to harangue our group, demanding that all workers return to their respective shops. Quote, you must stay in your shops. The others are big enough to take their responsibilities, end quote. Among the CGT delegates, only one of the 88 delegates is furious. He does not understand this position. Where are the delegates from 31? End quote. Mottet's description of these 2 days at Billancourt provides an overview of the problems faced by workers trying to organize strike actions independently of union control. They began and ended in isolation. The unions moved quickly and efficiently to contain any threat to their positions and exerted tremendous pressure on workers to act only on union command. The quote clearly shows the CGT representatives using these tactics to confine strike initiatives to the shops from which they came. By Wednesday, August 20th, Mottet's strike movement had been reduced to small meetings involving workers from adjacent shops. On that day, L'Humanité reported on the, quote, spectacular meeting, end quote, of the CGT FOCFTC. Mottet reports being muzzled about the meeting and its location outside the factory, and not in the immense and politically significant areas where the 4CV assembly lines were located. The, quote, spectacular meeting, end quote, did not therefore employ the most symbolically loaded areas of the Billancourt political landscape. The balance of Mottet's article lists other examples of worker initiative running up against CGT, quote, sabotage, which undercut autonomous action in support of the PTT workers during the strike's last days. In one shop, an informal meeting was broken up because the organization of the shop was such that two workers continuing to work meant that all the shop's machinery ran, making as much noise as if everyone was working. Near the end of the article, Mottet reports that a small committee issued a call for action on the part of all metal workers in the Paris region. Nothing happened. When Mottet arrived at the factory the next morning, the AOC was working. The CGT delegate told the workers during a meeting held later in the morning that, quote, the strike committees have been organized for a long time. They are out playing belote. No one wants them to take an interest in the strike, end quote. New section. Conclusion. Castoriadis wrote the following assessment of the 1953 actions, quote, first of all, it is clear that the ideological obstacles preventing this avant-garde from organizing itself and acting have not been eliminated. There are no elements in the objective situation today than there were yesterday that would enable these workers to define a program for themselves or to manifest a proletarian form of organization. Even if a few spontaneous class actions suddenly appear, the situation will not be greatly modified. Certain questions, for example, the form of organization or the direction of struggle and their objectives, the direction of struggles and their objectives, will be posed immediately by the facts themselves, although in an initially narrow form. In this atmosphere, the avant-garde will again be sensitized to Marxist thought and ideology, and a fusion could take place between them and militants of revolutionary Marxist groups. End quote. Castoriadis. The East Berlin, quote, June days and the PTT strike are evidence of an emergent worker avant-garde, one that is, like most of us, hobbled by entanglements with the dominant ideology and limited in perspective because it is tied to immediate concerns in ways that are shaped by that ideology. These limitations could be overcome, practically, if more autonomous actions are undertaken. Here there is an assumption either of a kind of contact that runs laterally across the working class, or something on the order of the zeitgeist. On the one hand, such contact is the result of political action and not its precondition, just as communication across the fragmented environments of contemporary industrial production is accomplished by militants and not a presupposition for militant action. On the other hand, it is symmetrical with the idea internal to Socialisme Barbarie that these actions signaled the beginning of what would become a mounting wave of proletarian action, one that appeared, on one level, to culminate in the Hungarian Revolution. A consequence of this ongoing practical movement that would enable a recognition of limits and obstacles on the part of the worker avant-garde was an increased contact with the Marxian tradition, which would in turn transform these actions by transforming the levels of awareness shaping their unfolding. This relationship is then a natural horizon that shapes any possibility of revolutionary action. The work of a revolutionary organization like Socialisme Barbarie has a fundamental role to play in encouraging and shaping this interaction. A revolutionary organization characterized as a party in the above can facilitate this overall orientation through the development and dissemination of a vision of socialism. The organization also had an important role to play in encouraging the worker avant-garde to act in a coherent, self-reflexive way to deal with problems of organization and continuity. In addition to assessing the overall situation of this emergent worker avant-garde, the group undertook a comparative reading of demands. At the most basic register, when workers decided to act autonomously, they did so in order to gain control over their professional lives. This is expressed in the fact that, given the opportunity, workers organized themselves along direct democratic lines in the form of strike committees. Seen from a perspective informed by Socialisme Barbarie, these committees would be a germinal form of workers' councils. It is also expressed in the fact that the demands generated in these contexts tended to converge on the general question of hierarchy. For the group, a basic demand for worker management of production lay behind the problem of hierarchy. In order to draw out the revolutionary potential posited by these actions, Socialisme Barbarie extended its perspective forward in time. The radical potential of the form of organization in questions of hierarchy and control could be clarified with reference to a vision of socialism understood as direct democracy instituted by workers' councils. The projection gave Socialisme Barbarie the basis for a, quote, revolutionary perspective, in terms which it tried to evaluate the, quote, socialist or, quote, revolutionary content of a given action. Within the group, this perspective was framed as an aspect of a dialogue with the worker avant-garde and would presumably find its way to them in the form of the journal. It would be the central message stuffed in bottles and tossed into the ocean. The 1953 strikes provided more specific information as well. Both had their origin in conflicts that set workers against trade unions, political organizations, and the state. This coincided with the group's theory of bureaucratic capitalism. There was another confirmation at the level of demands. Both strikes occurred in the context of marked increases in the rate of work, or what Marx called intensive exploitation. Particularly in East Berlin, cadence increases were accompanied by attempts to reorganize work, to extend the reach of standardized and rationalized production into semi-skilled and skilled forms of labor. From the viewpoint of the worker, then, rationalization was about de-skilling and the loss of professional identity and/or autonomy, and about its consequences for production rates. Conflicts over production norms are conflicts of its organization, and thus over the control of production. They are political and not merely economic or efficiency issues. Socialisme Barbarie had a parallel view of wage issues. Workers loudly objected to any restructuring of rates because such restructuring usually amounted to pay cuts, whether directly or indirectly. Here the two actions considered were empirically quite different. There was a move to piece rates and other similar attempts to use wage levels, or to spur increased production output amongst the building trades in East Berlin. These accompanied the introduction of Taylorist organization into previously autonomous trades. With the PTT, the strike happened in a space of organizational and technological stagnation, coupled with increasing volume as a function of failure on the part of the state to invest in infrastructure. These factors packaged wage freezes, de facto cuts, in conservative austerity. But for Socialisme Barbarie, what was significant about wage demands was that, when workers generated the issue in the context of autonomous actions, they never limited themselves to the economic dimension. They invariably coupled wage demands with demands for increased control over the organization of work. These demands for control flowed from what Socialisme Barbarie saw as the fundamental reality of shop floor life. Workers experienced production through the mediation of informal worker collectives that practically elaborate a type of hierarchy fundamentally opposed to that embodied in Fordist production design. Understanding these informal collectives was thus a central empirical, political, and philosophical issue. And that's the end of Chapter 2 of Looking for the Proletariat by Stephen Hastings-King. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you for hearing me scream at my car.